Finally, we come to the Victorian era and gender roles. By the mid-19th century, as a product of industrialization, we see the rise of the middle class. I've already noted how men began to work outside of the home in businesses and factories. Their wives began to stay at home and manage the household and the children. In other words, we start to see the rise of separate spheres. Women in the house, men outside the house, working outside of the home, in businesses and industry. This is the case of the middle class. As I noted, the middle class was a relatively new class, growing in size and socioeconomic status. But the middle class itself was stratified. It had levels. At the top, growing in number and most prominent, were the white collar. The white collar individuals were managers, lawyers, accountants, professionals, doctors, for example. They were called white collar because they strapped on a white collar to their shirts. They were salaried workers and consequently made more than other members of the middle class. They had attained their position through education and training. In the middle, mid-level management, the supervisors, small business owners, teachers. They had to some degree been educated and owned some property. At the bottom were small businessmen, farmers, artisans, and preachers. Many of these had existed prior to and continued to exist during the American industrial period. It is the white-collared upper middle class whose gender roles we're going to discuss. The Victorian era originated out of England during the reign of English Queen Victoria. She ruled England from 1844 to 1900. In England, this was a period of tremendous economic growth and imperialist expansion. It is a time when the English middle class grew and their values became widely embraced in England and subsequently in the United States. This middle class also began to arise in the United States in the 19th century. This middle class continued to grow in prosperity. Its values, its culture, and its gender roles that emerged during this time became the well-established, long-lasting gender roles that we label Victorian, and that continue well into the 20th century. These are the values, the definitions of marriage and family that we'll study. It is important to note that gender is a social historical construct. Ideas of masculinity and femininity change over time depending upon the members of society and how they perceive male and female. Your sex is something with which you're born. It involves biology and genitalia. Your gender is something that is created on the basis of your sex. But again, it is a social construct. Because it is constructed, it can also be changed. In the 19th century, in the Northeast, amongst the middle class, gender ideals became quite polarized and dichotomous. In other words, they defined women one way and men in another. If a woman was weak, a man was strong. If a woman was nurturing, a man was not. If a woman stayed in the home, the man's place was outside of the home. These are examples of the polar, dichotomous nature of gender roles in middle-class 19th century Victorian United States. For a woman, her greatest asset, particularly as a young single woman, was her beauty. And the ideal in the 19th century was pale and frail. Her light alabaster skin reflected the fact that she worked not outside of the home, but inside of the home. It was believed that women were by nature more frail than men. We'll talk about some of the sources of this perception in a minute. Women's curves are what was most attractive to the male. It's what defined her in terms of the opposite sex. Consequently, the breasts and the hips were emphasized amongst middle-class women. The ideal woman was a virginal one. Men wanted to marry virgins, and one protected one's virginity. The middle-class Victorian woman was also a modest woman in her appearance. She would not be ostentatious. She would wear no makeup. Makeup is not widely acceptable until the 20th century as a result of Hollywood and the flapper. She was also modest in her morality. She was an upstanding moral individual. Increasingly in the middle class, education was an asset. One could have some formal education through the public school system or through tutors, but it also involved a pragmatic component. A good single woman, in order to catch a man, had to know how eventually to manage a household. She had to know which fork was used for which course in a meal. She had to know how to set a table impeccably. She had to know how to entertain her guests when her husband brought home a boss and his wife, for example, for dinner. Piano playing, singing were often forms of entertainment that a young lady exhibited as a positive attribute. She was also educated in child rearing. She had to know how to manage a household as well as how to rear a child. In the mid-19th century, she was supposed to be domestic as well. The concept of the cult of domesticity arose. It involved a nuclear family and a single-family home. Most families were still extended in nature, involving grandparents, aunts, cousins, in the case of the slaves, sometimes non-blood relations. In the middle class, this concept of the nuclear family began to arise, of mom, dad, and kids. Increasingly, while most did not have their own home, in the middle class they did, the famous Victorian household, usually a two-storied home. In this home, the family lived. Everybody was assigned a place and a role. Children were to be seen and not heard. Women were to create a refuge for their male, so when he returned from the dog-eat-world dog of industrialization and competition, he could seek refuge and be cared for and nurtured. This cult of domesticity was elevated amongst the middle class and continued to grow throughout the 19th and into the 20th centuries. Many of our ideas about home and family arise from this 19th century notion. In order to get those curves and to emphasize her femininity, women increasingly wore corsets. Here you see examples of a corset. On the left is a visual representation of a corset. Corsets were often made of whalebone or metal. They provided the framework of the corset. The corset was put on, as you can see here, usually by maybe another female relative or domestic servant, and laced up the back. The ideal in the Victorian age was to create an 18 to 22 inch waist. You can see that from these photos that the appearance is quite unnatural. The proportion of the upper and lower body is distorted by that small waist. As a consequence of wearing these corsets, internal injuries oftentimes occurred. You see here the normal internal organ layout of the average woman. Wearing a corset over the course of years compressed these organs and obviously made for problematic health. It also lent itself to the notion of the pale, frail Victorian woman. Oftentimes, because of decreased lung capacity, a woman found it difficult to go up a flight of stairs. Consequently, women began to be perceived as the weaker sex. The ideal Victorian male was that of the provider. He was less scrutinized for how he looked, for his physical appearance, than for his ability to provide. Increasingly amongst the middle class in the Northeast in the Victorian era, men were to become the sole providers of the family. This was not the case elsewhere amongst farm families, immigrant industrial families, or slave families. But because he was a salaried worker with a skill, he was able to make enough money to allow his wife and children to stay home and not work in the field in the factories. In order to acquire such jobs, he needed an education. We just talked about education, how increasingly it was being promoted in the United States. The Victorian ideal helped facilitate the growth of education. Increasingly, individuals believed that education was a means to a better socioeconomic end, a better job. While not necessarily judged for his physical attractiveness, he was judged by his outer appearance in terms of clothes. The clothes made the man. One could tell from the kind of clothing that one wore from which class he came. Here you see that the top hat, the white collar, and the long tails were oftentimes a sign of one's status and position in society. Working class men did not wear these. They wore jeans, the blue collar shirt, the suspenders. So one could tell immediately if you were a woman and wanted to marry a middle or upper class man by his appearance who belonged to these classes. The male was also a political animal. We associate voting with democracy. At that point, we know democracy was limited to American citizens who were male over 21. But men took this very seriously, and voting was often perceived as a masculine endeavor. Consequently, it made it very difficult for the females who did want to vote. But men who could vote tried to vote, and oftentimes did, to a much greater degree than we do today. They also had stronger party affiliations than many Americans do today. They associated themselves with the growing Democratic or Republican parties that existed by 1854. Men were required to marry, as were women. But one could love a woman or find a woman of a lower class attractive. He was never to marry those women. Marriage was in many respects a means to social advancement, so he looked for a woman within his class or above his class who could further his career and socioeconomic ambitions. Once married, the man was the king of his castle. I talked about how the American middle-class home became a refuge from the dog-eat-dog world. Many of these individuals were mid-level management, oftentimes bossed around by their superiors. But when they came home, they could be the king of their castle. It was ultimately their needs and demands that needed to be met in the middle-class home. Oftentimes, men were perceived as stoic. It was the woman who was emotional and the nurturer. Men were supposed to be above this, being distant and unemotional for the purposes of provision. Increasingly, men were perceived as emotionless, which was be problematic in the 20th and 21st century. They were also perceived as more sexual than women. Consequently, we'll see later on that prostitution thrived in the Victorian era as a necessary evil. The ultimate goal in the middle class was marriage. Courtships were long. You usually dated someone within or above your class. Marriages were restricted, whereas today we want to marry for love, and that could surpass ethnic, class, or racial boundaries. The idea of marriage and to whom you could marry was very restricted. So too was courtship. Today it's not unusual for couples on a first date to kiss or to engage even in premarital sex. This was highly frowned upon in the 19th century, particularly amongst the middle and upper classes. There was no casual kissing. A young lady who was kissed would take that as a sign of a more formal and long-term commitment and intention on the part of the male who did so. Premarital sex was highly frowned upon, of course, because of the emphasis on virginity. No woman wanted to not be a virgin when she was married. The prospect of marriage would be more difficult if she had had premarital sex. Marriage was not done so much for love. Love was secondary. Today, the primary emphasis of marriage is love, and about 9 out of 10 of us, until recent years, have continued to marry. That's the case of the Victorian age, too. 9 out of 10 married. However, while we marry for love, oftentimes marriage was for social stability, economic stability, and social advancement. Women wanted security. They may not always love the person to whom they were now married, but they at least could be provided for. Men may not necessarily love the woman to whom they were married, but she could be a good child producer. So consequently, this was a very narrow definition of marriage, which is currently being challenged. If marriage, we believe, is for love, then it does question the notion of gay marriage. Should people who love one another be able to marry regardless of their sexual preference? The 19th century notion of marriage started with a formal wedding. Our notions of weddings come from the 19th century. Wedding was a formal affair, oftentimes to display one's social status and wealth, and a woman wore a white dress as a symbol of her continued virginity. The father, who had been the caretaker of his daughter, now gave the bride away. The groom waited for the father and the bride to walk up the aisle, and then power and responsibility would be transferred from the father to the groom. In the marriage ceremony, the female promised to love, honor, and obey. Obedience was something expected of women, and a woman who did not obey could be beaten legally by her husband. The male, on the other hand, promised to love, honor, and cherish. He would cherish his wife. These were the exchange of vows. After the ceremony, usually a preacher, minister, or priest would pronounce the couple man and wife. In other words, a man remained a man. He was a provider as well as a husband. He worked outside of the home as well as provided inside of the home, whereas the woman was now wife. This became her primary identity, not as individual, with a life outside of the home, but a life inside of the home, caring for her husband and eventually her children. It was not uncommon, as it is today, to take the last name of one's husband. After all, the woman had inherited her father's last name, and now she would acquire her husband's last name. Today, you see many women challenging this notion and keep their last name for business purposes, professional, and personal reasons. It was highly contentious to do so in the 19th and even through the 20th centuries. Marriage was not a partnership. Oftentimes we perceive marriage for that purpose. It's a partnership of equals. Even though we have distinct roles in that partnership, we believe ourselves to be equals. That is not the case in the Victorian age. It was not a partnership of equals. Oftentimes, the woman was assumed to be a minor, a childlike individual who had to be cared for by her husband, almost assuming a parental role over. Here you see some of the images of the Victorian wedding as portrayed in advertising, postcards. You see the giving away of the bride, you see the white dress, you see the lavish display of social class in the reception. First comes love, then comes marriage. Now we need the baby in the baby carriage. Sex. Sex, our ideas about sexuality, oftentimes come from the Victorian 19th century middle class. Prior to this period, Oftentimes women were seen as very sexual creatures. It had been a woman who had tempted Adam in the Garden of Eden, for example, and those ideas about sensuality and sexuality continued until the mid-19th century. But eventually ideas about sex and sexuality began to change. These ideas remain for the next 1 century in the United States, and to some degree continue to exist today, but not without challenge. Sex was not a public affair, and it was not something done before marriage. As I said, a woman was supposed to be a virgin. She was valued for her virginity. Both males and females were discouraged from engaging in any sort of sexual pleasure or activity. Consequently, masturbation, self-pleasure, was discouraged. Many of the stereotypes that have arisen in relation to masturbation come from the 19th century, such as the notion that if you do it, you're going to grow hair on your palms or go blind. Neither of which are true, of course. They did instill fear on those who wanted to engage in such activity and deterred them from doing so. The attitude is very different than it is today. Today we talk very openly about sex. You see sex in movies and TV, in the newsstands, in the publications. But the notion in the Victorian age was that the little that is said about sex and sexuality, the better it will be for the morals of community. In other words, if we don't talk about sex, we won't want to do it. Freud obviously counters that and recognizes that sexuality is one of our earliest and primal urges. Sex, in many respects, was for procreation and not so much for recreation. In other words, the end of the sexual act was to have a child and not so much to enjoy in physical pleasure of the individual. The dominant, most accepted sexual position, and again, we're making generalizations here, was the missionary position. In other words, man on top of woman. Not only would it yield pregnancy, but it reaffirmed the dominance of the man over the woman. The term missionary came from the 19th century, as England and the United States, as well as other European powers, were engaged in imperialistic expansion in Africa and Asia. Oftentimes, it was the missionary who went to these territories to Christianize and, quote, civilize these individuals. Those who engaged in these areas of Africa, islands, or Asia oftentimes utilized different sexual positions, rear entry, for example. This was increasingly seen as uncivilized, un-Western. The missionary position became the most well-accepted position of sex amongst middle class in Western Europe and the United States in the 19th century. Sex was an act to be conducted in the privacy of one's bedroom. Today we see sexual activity in cars, public places. It doesn't mean that that didn't happen in the past, that they didn't do it in the barns or in the fields. But oftentimes the bedroom became a sanctuary for sex. It was a private act between a couple. It was not to be on public display. But sex was oftentimes something feared by women. Part of it had to do with the unknown. As we said, the attitude in 19th century Victorian society was that the less that is said about it, the better it will be for the morals of the community. So oftentimes young couples, especially women, had very little knowledge about sex and pregnancy. And as a consequence, a fear arose. It wasn't uncommon in the 19th and even the 20th centuries for parents to have the famous talk with their daughter or son the day or two before marriage, so they'd have a greater idea of knowing what to expect in the bedroom as a married couple. There's also fear of pregnancy. Pregnancy was often a dangerous time in one's life. It could yield the death of the child as well as the woman. And the more pregnancies that a woman had, the greater the chance of her dying from it or of complications of it. Also, a lot of Victorian women did not enjoy sex because they were told to be asexual, that they were moral creatures, almost on a pedestal, who were above sexual urges, and sex debased them. Consequently, we're going to see in the 1960s and 70s a sexual revolution that counters these ideas about female sexuality. Sex was also one-sided. Again, if women were not to be sexual or assumed asexual and they didn't enjoy it, then the male, of course, was not going to try to pleasure her. Of course, again, this is a generalization. It did happen. Each couple varied, but by and large, it was he who achieved pleasure in the sexual act. Notice that we're talking about sexual relations and marital relations between opposite sex. In the 19th century, this was the only kind of relationship that Victorian society and eventually larger American society accepted. The notion that a man must marry a woman or a woman marry a man. Bisexuality, gay marriage was unheard of and seen as aberrant in the 19th century, and those ideas continued in the 20th century as well. A woman who desired sexual pleasure might feel guilty about asking for it. Oral sex, for example, was something that she might not condone or not want to ask for. He might also feel the same way, feeling that it was outside of the social norms sanctioned by Victorian society. Hence, Sigmund Freud, 19th century psychologist, is going to study both female sexuality and instinct and begin to see some of the repressive practices and beliefs as the source of sexual frustration amongst Victorian women in England, Austria, and the United States in the 19th century. Eventually, couples did want to limit in the middle class the number of their children. Part of that had to do with the fact that they wanted to provide more for their children. And to do so, they'd have to have fewer of them. Again, this is something amongst the middle class, not amongst other groups in American society. However, their birth control options were fairly limited. The term birth control in itself is a 20th century term coined by Margaret Sanger, whom I will discuss later on. Nonetheless, in the 19th century, what means did one have in trying to prevent pregnancy? This was studied by Robert Owen and Charles Knowlton. One took it from a population limitation point of view, the other from a more personal pleasure point of view. Both acknowledged that abstinence would indeed not produce children, but the reality was that amongst a married couple, sex was an expected aspect of life, and not abstinence, a not very pragmatic way to approach sex and the relationship. There was the rhythm method, knowing when one can have sex and conceive. At this point, one would want to abstain from sex. And yet again, though, in the 19th century, public information about such matters was fairly limited, so was the scientific knowledge regarding it. Coitus interruptus, the withdrawal method, that a man would withdraw before ejaculation. Many couples tried that. Many couples do try that. It also is not a fail-safe way to prevent pregnancy. There were no condoms. Condoms were associated with prostitutes. They were sheep intestine and not latex like we have today. But to use a condom would be to interfere with the natural course of a relationship. And so condoms were heavily frowned upon. Only with the rise of AIDS and the AIDS scares and the notion that AIDS can prevent sexually transmitted diseases have condoms become more pervasive and accepted in American society. During the Victorian society, what we have is a double standard. A middle class that on the surface says everything should be private, women should be asexual, appearances are most important. But ironically, during the same age, prostitution thrived in cities. It was rampant. It was seen as a necessary evil. Men, married men, not just single men, oftentimes frequented prostitutes. In many respects, the married woman turned a blind eye and allowing the prostitutes to perform the sexual act she felt guilty about doing. Men also felt more comfortable asking for things such as oral sex from prostitutes rather than from their wives. Unfortunately, prostitution had its negative side in the home. Oftentimes men contracted syphilis, which was the AIDS of the 19th century. Syphilis could not yet be combated with penicillin, and a man who contracted syphilis could pass it on to his wife. Sterility, the inability to have children, blindness, mental health issues, and even death could result from syphilis. It is these ideals about Victorian marriage, family, gender, that in part gave rise to the desire for reform. Victorian women, not all but many, began to feel constricted by the narrow definitions of femininity, by being restricted to the home, by not having the right to vote, and increasingly began to push for greater rights in America. In 1840, two women, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were denied seating at the London Anti-Slavery Convention. They were not allowed in purely because they were women. This discrimination also led these two women to promote reform and eventually create the Seneca Falls Convention. It is also a belief in enlightened principles of the notions of rights and equality that were being espoused and had been espoused since the American Revolution that women were latching onto. They extended the notion of rights, privileges, and equality to men and women. Consequently, and eventually, in 1848, Seneca Falls Convention was convened in Seneca Falls, New York. It was the first ever convention in world human history devoted to women's rights. It occurred over the course of 2 days. Its organizers were Lucretia Mott, a Quaker. Quakers had long and hard lobbied for the equality of all, not just women and men, but of blacks and whites, and been the earliest proponents to abolish slavery, and a mother and wife, and also anti-slave and women's rights advocate, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. These two women convened the convention that would launch reform in America. On the first day, only women could attend, but on the next, men were invited to participate. One of those significant individuals was Frederick Douglass. I've earlier mentioned him, a former slave and an activist in the abolitionist movement. He noted that this was not just about women's rights, but about human rights. Eventually, at this convention, the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions was drafted. You need to read that declaration, understand how women perceive their position in 19th century America, and look at some of the rights that they demand. What we'll see is the immediate results were few. Unlike temperance, that yielded the immediate end or decline of drinking, and unlike abolition, that would end slavery in 1865 as a consequence of the Civil War, women would not get the right to vote until 1920 and the 19th Amendment. This convention starts the momentum for that vote and for that right. The success of the reform movements varied, and we'll come back to many of these reform movements as their achievements were limited and how future generations would pick up the cause and promote them throughout the 20th century. During the 19th century, it is the music of Stephen Foster that many of these reformers were oftentimes referred to as the songwriter of America. You've heard his music, perhaps you've even sung his songs, but perhaps you have not known about the man who wrote those songs. This is the beginning of our discussion of American music and its evolution in the United States from the 19th through the 21st centuries. Periodically, you will hear music interjected. You should pay attention to that music, as it's not just serving as background music, but as important means of understanding American life and culture. In terms of his background, Stephen Foster was born into a large family who resided near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He lived a comfortable lifestyle, as his father was a middle-class businessman. Unfortunately, like many men that we've talked about, his father drank, and his father lost a lot of money when Stephen Foster was a young child. By the age of 7, Stephen Foster showed an interest in music, and he began composing pieces of music on piano. The piano was the instrument of the middle and upper middle class home of the day. For purposes of recreation and entertainment, one would learn how to play the piano. By the age of 14, he had his first song written, and the age of 18, his first song published. Like most middle-class sons, he was encouraged to go to college by his father, and he did. He went to Jefferson College, but due to homesickness and a desire to pursue music, he left that college only after 1 week. In 1846, he moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, and worked as a bookkeeper for his brother's shipping business. It turned out that this would be influential to his music. It is here, along the Ohio River, that he became exposed to Irish ballads and plantation and river culture. In the South, blackface minstrel shows were being widely performed. They were traveling shows where whites donned a black face. They put on burnt cork or shoe polish and presented caricatures of slaves in the American South. Some of the most famous of the troops was E.P. Christie, leader of the Christie Minstrels. It would be this traveling show that would popularize the music of Stephen Foster. Stephen Foster's first big hit, and probably his most famous song, was "Oh, Susanna."
Oh, Susanna, oh, don't you cry for me. I come from Alabama with my banjo on my knee. I had a dream the other night when
It was composed in 1847-48. With the expansion of the nation because of the transportation revolution, the growth of the sheet music industry, and because of minstrel shows, the song became a nationwide hit. It launched the birth of national pop culture. Stephen Foster continued to write songs in the 1840s and 50s, some of which include Camptown Races, Old Folks at Home, My Old Kentucky Home, Beautiful Dreamer, and I Dream of Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair. He was so prolific and a song so popular that he was referred to by a New York musical publisher as the Songwriter of America. His songs were catchy, easy to sing, sometimes frivolous in nature, but sometimes Stephen Foster tapped into what he saw, Southern slavery. In a song, Nellie Was a Lady, he defines and portrays Nellie, a slave woman, in dignified terms. He also wrote about economic hardship, with both his father, himself, underwent. In 1859, he wrote the famous work Hard Times. It was about economic hard times, poverty, and recession. This is a precursor to another song of the 1920s and 30s that I'll talk about during the Great Depression, Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? His last big song was Beautiful Dreamer. While his professional life seemed to be solid, his personal life was on shaky ground. He married Jane McDowell in 1850 and had a daughter, Marion. But he was constantly distracted by his music and continued to drink. As a consequence, his wife left him, only to return and to leave him again. Foster also, in spite of all of his many tunes, failed to see much financial result. Due to unfavorable contracts, he did not make much money. He continued drinking because of his personal and professional hardships. Eventually, after drinking and going on a binge, he fell, cut his neck, and died 3 days later. His life was a short one. He was born on July 4th, 1826, and died January 13th, 1864. And yet his music lives. Foster's life and career exemplify many things, including the limited impact of temperance. Obviously, temperance efforts were failing if both his father and Stephen Foster himself drank to the point, in this case, of death. It also signifies the birth and the rise of mass pop culture, which will continue to grow throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. It also shows the problems of artists and composers and the fickle nature of the music industry. Problematic copyrights did not yield financial success. When Stephen Foster died, he had a mere 3 cents in his pocket. The fickle nature of the industry is still with us. A writer needs to cater to new musical tastes, and eventually musical tastes were changing in the late 19th century. Marching band music that we'll talk about and rags started to be the rage of the day, and Stephen Foster couldn't catch up to those musical tastes. We also see the ability of music to increase social awareness. Through his songs about slavery and through his Irish ballads, he was able to educate middle-class Americans about both. And finally, we see the universal, timeless nature of his songs. We may not have known who Stephen Foster was, but we may have sung his songs around campfires and in our schools.
Till